On the 7th of December 1787, 30 men gathered in a room in Dover, a quiet town in one of the smallest territories in the newly independent United States. Outside, the young nation was still fragile. 13 former colonies, barely held together by arguments, debts, and a governing document that most people were still not sure they trusted. Inside that room, the 30 men voted, unanimously 30-0. It took them 3 days to decide and about 3 minutes to vote. Delaware had just become the first state to ratify the Constitution of the United States, and in doing so it earned a title it has never relinquished. The first state, but here is what makes that moment remarkable. The men in that room represented a territory so small you could drive across it in under an hour, a place that had been claimed, lost, abandoned and reclaimed by 4 different European powers before it was even a generation old, a place whose entire population at the time could fit inside a modern football stadium. And yet the decisions made in Delaware, in that ratification room, in its corporate law chambers, in its gunpowder mills and chemistry laboratories, quietly shaped the world that billions of people live in today. More than 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies are legally incorporated in Delaware. The bulletproof vest protecting soldiers in conflict zones right now is made from a material invented in Delaware. And the Constitution that governs the most powerful nation in history, Delaware said yes to it first. How did the second smallest state in America end up carrying so much of the weight of history? This is the entire history of Delaware, the first state. Long before any European eye had ever seen the coastline of what we now call Delaware, human beings had been living on this land for at least 12,000 years. The first inhabitants arrived at the tail end of the last ice age, Paleo-Indians who drifted into the region following the retreating glaciers, hunting the great animals of the ancient world. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, ancient bison, a world that has since entirely vanished. As the millennia passed and the climate warmed, the cultures of the region grew more sophisticated. By the Archaic period, the people of Delaware had transitioned from pure nomadic hunting into a way of life that combined hunting, fishing, and the harvesting of the rich marine resources along the coastline and river systems that define this landscape. Shell middens, enormous piles of oyster and clam shells, found across the state today tell the story of communities that thrived on the extraordinary abundance of the Delaware River, the Delaware Bay, and the Atlantic shore. By the time Europeans arrived, 2 main groups of native people dominated the region. In the north, along the banks of the Delaware River and its tributaries, lived the Lenni Lenape, a name that translates simply as the real people, or the original people. They were part of the great Algonquian language family that stretched up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and they were, by every account of those who encountered them, a remarkably sophisticated society. The Lenape lived in villages of longhouses, practiced agriculture, cultivated corn, beans and squash, and had developed trade networks that extended hundreds of miles into the interior of the continent. Their society was organised not by rigid hierarchy, but by a system of clans, 3 of them based on maternal descent, that created bonds of kinship and obligation across the entire community. Leadership among the Lenape was earned through wisdom and counsel, not birthright. In the south and along the coastline lived the Nanticoke and the Assateague, equally ancient peoples with their own languages, customs and deep connections to the land and water they had inhabited for generations beyond counting. These were the peoples who watched, with what must have been a mixture of curiosity and alarm, as strange ships began to appear on the horizon in the early years of the 17th century. The first European to record seeing the waters of Delaware Bay was an English explorer sailing for the Dutch, Henry Hudson, whose C09 voyage in search of a passage to Asia brought him to the coastline of the mid-Atlantic. Hudson noted the bay but did not linger. He continued north, where the great river that now bears his name offered him what seemed a more promising route. What Delaware Bay lacked in navigational excitement, it more than made up for in strategic value. The Dutch would soon recognise this. The name Delaware itself came not from the Dutch, but from an Englishman. In 1610, Captain Samuel Argall, sailing from the Virginia colony, entered the bay during a storm and named it in honour of Lord Delaware, Sir Thomas West, the first colonial governor of Virginia. The name stuck, and in time it attached itself not only to the bay and the river, but to the land, the people, and eventually the state itself. The Lenape, who had called this place home for millennia, found themselves renamed in the language of people they had never met. The Dutch were the first Europeans to attempt a permanent settlement. In 1631, the Dutch West India Company established a small colony near present-day Lewis, in the southern part of the state, which they called Swannendale, the Valley of the Swans. It was a name chosen for its beauty. The reality was rather less poetic. The colony's relations with the local Lenape began promisingly enough, with trade and peaceful exchange. Then a misunderstanding, and accounts differ as to exactly what happened, but it appears that a Lenape man removed a metal coat of arms that the Dutch had posted as a marker of territorial claim, escalated rapidly and fatally. Dutch response to the incident provoked a retaliatory attack by the Lenape. When a Dutch supply ship arrived in 1632 to check on the settlers, it found the colony utterly destroyed. Every single one of the approximately 28 colonists was dead. Swannendael lasted barely a year. For several years, the Dutch maintained a presence in the region only through trading vessels and occasional outposts, unwilling to commit to full colonization of a territory that had already consumed one settlement entirely. But events in Europe were about to introduce a new player into the contest for the Delaware Valley, one that no one would have expected. In the late 1630s, Sweden was one of the great military powers of Europe. The 30 Years' War had transformed it into a formidable empire, with territories stretching across Scandinavia, Finland, Estonia, and parts of modern Russia, Poland, and Germany. In late 1637, two ships, the Kalmar Nickel and the Fogel Grip, sailed from the Swedish port of Gothenburg carrying the first expedition of the New Sweden Company. At its helm was a man with a remarkable history, Peter Minuit, a Belgian-born former governor of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, who had previously and infamously purchased the island of Manhattan from the Lenape for trade goods worth the equivalent of about $24. Having fallen out with the Dutch, Minuit had switched employers. Now he was bringing his expertise in colonial settlement and his knowledge of dealing with the Lenape to serve the Swedish crown. The expedition arrived in Delaware Bay in March 1638. Minuit met with 5 Lenape chiefs and purchased a substantial tract of land along the Christina River, named after Sweden's 12-year-old queen. On the rocky point where the Christina River meets the Brandywine Creek, a site that would one day become the city of Wilmington, the colonists built a fort. They called it Fort Christina. It was the first permanent European settlement in the entire Delaware Valley, and it was Swedish. For the next 17 years, New Sweden clung to existence along the banks of the Delaware River. 12 more expeditions followed the first, bringing settlers from Sweden, Finland, and the Netherlands. At its peak, the colony numbered only about 400 people, a community so small that one particularly autocratic governor, Johan Prince, who ruled from 1643 to 1653, is said to have weighed around 400 pounds himself, earning the Lenape nickname Big Belly. Prince was also, by most accounts, something of a tyrant. In 1653, 22 colonists, representing a full quarter of the colony's male population, signed a petition complaining of his rule. He branded it a mutiny, had a soldier executed, and promptly packed his bags and returned to Sweden. The end of New Sweden came not through violence or starvation, but through Dutch military power. Peter Stuyvesant, the formidable Director General of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, had watched the Swedish presence on the Delaware with growing irritation for years. The last Swedish governor, Johan Rising, looked at the force assembled against him and made the only rational decision available. He surrendered. New Sweden was over, but something remarkable followed. Stuyvesant, rather than excelling the Swedish and Finnish colonists, permitted them to remain as a Swedish nation within the Dutch colony, free to govern themselves by their own court, worship in their own Lutheran churches, retain their land, and continue trading with the Lenape. The Swedish language would be used as a church language in the region until well into the 18th century. Old Swedes Church in Wilmington, built in 1698, still stands today as one of the oldest surviving church buildings in North America. New Sweden was gone as a political entity. Its people and its culture were not. The Dutch themselves did not hold Delaware for long. In 1664, English warships seized the entire Dutch colony of New Netherland, including the settlements along the Delaware River, without significant resistance. The Duke of York, the future King James II, was granted the territory by his brother King Charles II. The Swedish and Finnish settlers were once again simply told that they now had new masters. They continued as before to get on with their lives. The region known then as the Lower Counties on the Delaware became a complicated political possession. But Penn had a problem. Pennsylvania's land grant gave him no direct access to the ocean. All his trade would have to pass through territory controlled by others. Penn lobbied the Duke of York, and in 1682 he was granted the Lower Counties, the territory that would one day become Delaware, as a lease in perpetuity. For Penn, this was a solution to a geographic problem. For the people of the Lower Counties, it was the beginning of a complicated relationship with a larger, wealthier, and far more politically powerful neighbour. Penn governed both Pennsylvania and the Lower Counties jointly, but the two regions were very different in character. Pennsylvania was filling rapidly with Quakers, Germans, and other religious dissenters who shared Penn's idealistic vision of a peaceable colony. The lower counties were older, more ethnically diverse – Swedish, Finnish, Dutch, English – and deeply suspicious that their interests would always come second to those of Penn's wealthy Quaker community in Philadelphia. The tension simmered for 2 decades. Finally, in 1704, Penn granted the lower counties their own separate assembly, though they remained under the same governor as Pennsylvania. It was an awkward arrangement, but it gave the lower counties a degree of self-governance they had been demanding for years. It also, in a quiet but significant way, began to forge a distinct identity, separate from Pennsylvania, separate from Maryland, separate from any of the older European legacies. Something new was beginning to take shape. Throughout the middle decades of the 18th century, the population of the lower counties grew steadily. Wilmington, founded in 1731, grew into the region's most significant urban centre, powered by flour milling. The Brandywine Creek provided exceptional water power for grinding grain, as well as leatherworking, papermaking and trade along the Delaware River and Bay. The region was prosperous, well-connected and increasingly self-confident. It was also sitting on the edge of a revolution. By the 1760s, the lower counties on the Delaware were growing increasingly restless under British rule, just like the colonies to the north and south. When Britain imposed the Stamp Act in 1765, a direct tax on printed materials that struck many colonists as an outrageous overreach, Delaware refused to comply. Resistance was not yet revolutionary, but the direction of travel was becoming clear. When war finally came in 1775, and the Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia to consider the most consequential question in American history, independence from Britain, Delaware sent 3 delegates. Their names were Thomas McKean, George Read, and Caesar Rodney, and they were not of one mind. George Read, one of the 3, was opposed to independence. He was not a loyalist, exactly. He was a cautious man who believed the colonies were not yet ready for the step they were considering. When the vote for independence approached in late June and early July of 1776, it became clear that Delaware's delegation was deadlocked. Read against, McKean in favour, and Rodney, the 3rd man, was not even in Philadelphia. He was back in Dover, attending political business in the colony. What happened next became one of the most celebrated acts in American political history. On the evening of July 3rd, 1776, Caesar Rodney received word by express rider that his vote was needed urgently in Philadelphia. He climbed onto his horse and rode through the night, more than 70 miles through a violent thunderstorm, in the dark, along rough colonial roads. Rodney was not a well man. He suffered from a disfiguring facial cancer that he had been treating in England, and he wore a green silk scarf to cover the growth on his cheek. He rode through the night regardless. He arrived in Philadelphia the following morning, still wearing his boots and spurs, in time to cast Delaware's deciding vote in favour of independence. Delaware's vote had been secured. The Declaration of Independence would be unanimous among the 13 colonies. Delaware saw relatively little direct military action during the Revolutionary War. The only significant battle on Delaware soil was the small engagement at Couch's Bridge in September 1777, but the war came close enough to matter. British forces, advancing from the Chesapeake Bay toward Philadelphia, moved through Delaware's northern counties. General Washington dug in near Wilmington, but was outflanked. The British briefly occupied Wilmington and bombarded the town of Lewis from the sea. The Delaware Regiment, known informally as the Blue Hen Chicks after their regimental mascot, the Fighting Gamecocks of Delaware, fought with distinction across multiple major battles from Long Island to Trenton to Monmouth. And then came the moment that would define Delaware forever. With the Revolutionary War concluded and the newly independent states attempting to govern themselves under the flimsy framework of the Articles of Confederation, it became increasingly obvious that something stronger was needed. A constitutional convention was called in Philadelphia in 1787. Delaware sent 5 delegates: Richard Bassett, Gunning Bedford Jr., Jacob Broome, John Dickinson, and George Read. All 5 signed the final document, and Delaware's delegates fought especially hard for one crucial provision: equal representation for all states in the Senate regardless of size. As one of the smallest states in the Union, Delaware had every reason to fear being permanently overshadowed by larger neighbours. The 2-senator per state rule was, for Delaware, a matter of political survival. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. It then went to the states for ratification. Each state was to hold its own convention and vote. On October 24, the Delaware legislature called for a ratifying convention to meet in Dover. The convention was assembled on December the 4th. 3 days later, on December 7, 1787, 30 delegates voted unanimously 30-0 to ratify the Constitution of the United States. Delaware was the first. Pennsylvania ratified 5 days later. From that day forward, Delaware has been known by two words that carry more pride per syllable than almost any phrase in American political life: the first state. The new state of Delaware entered the 19th century with a quiet confidence. It was small. It was prosperous. It sat in the middle of the busiest commercial corridor in North America, sandwiched between Philadelphia to the north and Baltimore and Washington to the south. And in 1802, an event occurred along the Brandywine Creek that would shape the state's character for the next 200 years. Eleuthère René Dupont was a French immigrant, the son of a prominent French economist who had fled the violence of the Revolution in France and arrived in the United States in 1800. The younger Dupont had trained as a chemist and had worked in the French Royal Gunpowder Administration. Finding that the quality of American gunpowder was poor and demand was high, he saw a commercial opportunity. In 1802, he established a black powder factory on the banks of the Brandywine Creek just north of Wilmington, a location chosen for its reliable water power, its access to river transport, and its proximity to raw materials. The DuPont mills grew steadily through the first decades of the 19th century, supplying gunpowder to hunters, miners, and the United States military. It was dangerous work. Explosions were a regular, terrifying feature of life along the Brandywine. But the DuPont family built a tight-knit community around their mills: worker housing, support for injured employees and their families, a paternalistic but genuine sense of responsibility to the people who worked for them. By the time of the Civil War, the DuPont Company was the single largest manufacturer of black powder in the United States. It would go on to become something far greater. Delaware in the first half of the 19th century was also a state deeply, uncomfortably divided over the question of slavery. It occupied an almost impossible position, a border state in the most literal sense, sharing its southern border with Maryland and its cultural sympathies with both North and South. Slavery had existed in Delaware since the colonial period, but Quaker influence, radiating southward from Philadelphia, had gradually convinced many Delaware slave owners to free their slaves through the process of manumission. By 1810, nearly half of Delaware's black population was free. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, more than 90% were free. Roughly 20,000 free black men and women compared to only about 1,800 still enslaved. Yet Delaware's legislature, even as the free black population grew, could not bring itself to abolish slavery outright. In 1847, a bill to do exactly that was defeated by a single vote. President Lincoln in 1862 offered Delaware federal compensation to purchase the freedom of every remaining enslaved person in the state. The legislature rejected the offer. Delaware was, in its paradoxical way, a state where slavery was dying not through legal abolition, but through individual manumission, quietly, case by case, but never decisively. And through all of this, a remarkable network of courage was operating in plain sight. Wilmington's Quaker community maintained one of the most active stations on the Underground Railroad on the entire eastern seaboard. He continued his work until the end of the Civil War. Harriet Tubman, who made at least 13 missions to rescue enslaved people from Maryland, passed through Delaware on almost every one of those journeys. Thomas Garrett was one of her most trusted collaborators. The industrial north of the state, Wilmington, Newcastle County, tied economically and culturally to Philadelphia, and the wider northern economy, was firmly pro-Union. The agricultural south, Sussex County, its farms and tidewater communities more culturally aligned with Maryland and Virginia, harboured significant sympathy for the Confederate cause. Delaware's governor at the time, William Burton, was a Southern sympathizer. Both of the state's US senators opposed Lincoln's policy of using military force to keep the Union together. Representatives from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana traveled to Delaware to make the case for secession. For a brief and genuinely uncertain moment, it was unclear which way Delaware would fall. It stayed in the Union. Delaware's voters had already rejected secession by a clear margin in January 1861. And once war became inevitable, the state's industrial ties proved decisive. Henry Dupont, head of the DuPont Company and a leader of the new Republican Party in Delaware, made certain that not a single ounce of DuPont gunpowder went to Confederate forces. By the end of the war, DuPont had supplied nearly half of all the black powder purchased by the Union military. Originally built to protect the approaches to Philadelphia and Wilmington from naval attack, the fort became one of the largest Confederate prisoner of war camps in the North. At its peak, it held more than 12,000 Confederate prisoners, soldiers, officers, and political prisoners alike, in conditions that deteriorated steadily as the war dragged on. By the end of the conflict, approximately 2,500 prisoners had died there. Delaware emerged from the Civil War with its Union loyalty intact, but its conscience troubled. On February 8, 1865, 2 months before Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Delaware's legislature voted to reject the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the amendment that would abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. The gesture was futile. Other states ratified the amendment, and it took effect in December 1865, ending slavery in Delaware along with everywhere else. It also rejected both the 14th and 15th Amendments during Reconstruction, the amendments guaranteeing citizenship and voting rights to Black Americans. It was decidedly not among the first to extend the full promise of that document to all of its people. After the Civil War, Delaware settled into a period of steady industrial growth powered almost entirely by the expanding empire of the DuPont family. The DuPont Company, enriched by enormous wartime profits, began to diversify beyond black powder into the wider world of chemistry and materials. New products, new processes, new factories multiplied along the Brandywine and beyond. By the early 20th century, DuPont was not merely Delaware's largest employer. Coleman DuPont, an engineer and automobile enthusiast, personally financed the construction of the DuPont Highway, completed in 1923, a major north-south road that connected the southern part of the state to Wilmington and remains one of Delaware's main arteries today. His cousin Pierre S. DuPont organized and paid for the construction of new schools across the state during the 1920s, responding to the desperate inadequacy of Delaware's public education system. The DuPonts filled the gap, and in doing so they ensured that Delaware would for generations look to them as something between benefactors and rulers. The 20th century brought DuPont's greatest period of scientific invention. The company's research laboratories, among the most sophisticated in the world, came an extraordinary engine of material innovation. In 1935, DuPont chemist Wallace Carruthers and his team at the Wilmington Research Facility developed nylon, the world's first fully synthetic fiber. Produced entirely in a laboratory from coal, water and air, nylon would transform the textile industry globally, replacing silk in stockings, parachutes and hundreds of other applications. In the following decades, DuPont laboratories produced neoprene, synthetic rubber that transformed manufacturing, then Teflon, the non-stick surface that transformed cooking, then mylar, then lycra. The list goes on. A single company in a single small state changed the physical substance of the modern world. During the Second World War, DuPont's contributions extended into territory of almost incomprehensible significance. The company was contracted to design and build the Hanford site in Washington state, the plutonium production facility that provided the plutonium used in the Trinity test and the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. DuPont accepted the government contract for exactly $1, refusing to profit from the work. Delaware had supplied the gunpowder that won the Civil War. It helped supply the atomic bomb that ended the Second World War. The DuPont Company, enriched by enormous wartime profits, began to diversify beyond black powder into the wider world of chemistry and materials. The DuPont family invested heavily in Delaware's civic infrastructure. T. Another cousin, Alfred I DuPont, introduced old-age pensions and built a welfare home for the elderly in 1930. Delaware's government was small and its tax base limited. The company's research laboratories, among the most sophisticated in the world, became an extraordinary engine of material innovation. Nylon would transform the textile industry globally, replacing silk in stockings, parachutes and hundreds of other applications. Then Teflon, the non-sticks surface that transformed cooking, then mylar. During the Second World War, DuPont's contributions extended into territory of almost incomprehensible significance. DuPont accepted the government contract for exactly $1, refusing to profit from the work. Delaware had supplied the gunpowder that won the Civil War. It helped supply the atomic bomb that ended the Second World War. Delaware had always been the first state. But in 1809, it quietly began acquiring a second title, one that would prove in the long run at least as consequential as the first. In that year, Delaware's legislature passed the General Corporation Law, a piece of legislation designed to attract businesses to incorporate within the state by offering flexibility, privacy, and a legal framework more favourable to corporate management than anywhere else in the country. This meant that when corporate disputes landed in Delaware's courts, the outcomes were predictable, reasoned, and based on established law rather than the unpredictable emotions of a jury. Today, more than 2 million business entities are incorporated in Delaware, a number that exceeds the state's entire population. Thomas Jefferson is said to have called Delaware a jewel among the states, a small but precious thing of outsized value. Delaware had been a slave state. It had enforced Jim Crow laws well into the 1960s. Its schools were segregated. And it was, in fact, a Delaware case, Gebhardt v. Belton, that was heard alongside Brown v. Delaware's own courts had already ruled in favour of school desegregation before the Supreme Court's landmark decision, a fact that is often overlooked in the broader national telling of that history. The state's demographics shifted steadily through the post-war decades. The chemical industry, while still significant, no longer dominated in the way it once had. New industries arrived, particularly financial services, drawn by Delaware's favourable banking laws. The credit card revolution of the 80s sent thousands of banking jobs to Wilmington, as major financial institutions relocated their credit card operations to the state, attracted by Delaware's relaxed interest rate regulations. Delaware also produced one of the most significant political figures of the modern era, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. He would represent Delaware in the Senate for 36 years before serving 2 terms as vice president under Barack Obama, and finally winning the presidency itself in 2020, becoming the 46th President of the United States. Today, Delaware remains one of the most distinctive states in the American Union. It is the second smallest by land area, only Rhode Island is smaller. Its population is just under 1 million people, and yet the legal address of more corporations than there are Delawareans is registered within its borders. The constitution that governs the most powerful nation in history was first ratified in a small room in Dover by 30 men on a December afternoon in 1787. Delaware did not win the title of the first state through size or military power or natural wealth. It won it through something more durable, a willingness, again and again, to act decisively at moments when the course of history hung in the balance. Caesar Rodney, riding 70 miles through a thunderstorm to cast a vote. A single gunpowder mill on a creek in Wilmington that grew into a company that changed the material fabric of the modern world. A small legislature passed, a corporation law that quietly made Delaware the legal capital of the global economy. Small does not mean insignificant. Delaware has spent 4 centuries proving it. This has been the entire history of Delaware, the first state.